What will make us truly happy? Hi, I'm Mike Mason. This is St. Joe Society podcast. The St. Joe Society is a Catholic lay apostolate devoted to help men order all things to Christ by growing strong in mind, body, and spirit. If you'd like to learn more about our work, you can check us out online at stjoesociety.org. This is the Intro to Moral Theology, episode 10. And in this episode, we're going to try to answer the question, what will make us truly happy? Now, last week, I argued that the subjective goal of man's life is to become perfectly happy. Okay. Now, when I say the subjective goal of man's life is to be happy, I don't mean the goal is different for everybody. So I don't mean it's subjective in the sense of like, well, my goal is to be happy, your goal is to make money. No, what I mean by subjective here is that the goal of being happy, that's true for every person. It's subjective in the sense of happiness exists within the subject. Okay. So if you say, okay, the point of my life is to be happy. Well, where is my happy? It's in me. That's what I mean by subjective. Okay. Over the next 3 weeks, we're going to attempt to answer the question, what is the object that can bring about perfect happiness? So last week we said the goal of my life is to be perfectly happy. What object can do that? Okay. So this week we're going to talk about hedonism and utilitarianism as two possible approaches to becoming perfectly happy. Next week, we'll look at stoicism and evolutionism. And then I'm going to show why those four are all deficient views. And then the final week, we'll look at why God and God alone is the only object that can make us perfectly happy. So that's the plan of attack. Okay, let's just launch right in. The object of man's happiness. Now, when we're thinking about what object will ultimately make us happy, we have three choices. First, something below man will make us happy. Now, what do I mean below? What I mean is things like wealth, honor, fame, power, influence, stuff like that. Those are things that are below us, right? Because we're higher than wealth, honor, fame, power, all those sort of things. That's one option. Can one of those things make us perfectly happy? The second option, if let's say the first option is no. Second option would be, can man himself? So can we acquire enough goods of body and soul to make us perfectly happy? And if that one doesn't work, then it's got to be something above man. So it's either below man, in man, or above man. Okay. So let's start with something below man. In the Summa Theologiae, where St. Thomas Aquinas talks about what's the proper object of happiness, he goes through 9 different things that could possibly make someone happy. And though I'm not going to, maybe in the future episodes, we'll return to this theme and do this in more in depth. I'm not going to go each one of these one at a time, but one of the things he argues is that each of these things below us are deficient in making us perfectly happy. And what he argues is, he goes, at best, things like wealth, honor, fame, power, influence, pleasure, stuff like that, at best, it's necessary for happiness, but it's not sufficient to make someone perfectly happy. So in a sense, you need it to a certain extent to be happy. It doesn't make sense to say you're happy without it, but you can't equate the two with each other. Okay, so think about wealth, for example. Wealth can't be equated with happiness. Now, you need to have a certain amount of wealth to be happy, right? Even if the amount of wealth is just a roof over your head and food in your belly and clothes on your back. You do need a level of wealth to be happy, but being wealthy, okay, can't be equated to being happy. Okay, happiness is something distinct and different than being wealthy. Okay, that's the idea. And he goes through all those. Aristotle says it, in a real great quote in the Nicomachean Ethics, and I'll read it for you to kind of, summarize this in a nutshell. Aristotle says, we always desire happiness for its own sake and never as a means to something else. Whereas honor, pleasure, intelligence, and every virtue we desire partly for their own sakes, but partly also as a means to happiness, because we suppose they prove themselves instruments of happiness. Happiness, on the other hand, nobody desires for the sake of these things, nor indeed as a means to anything else. Happiness is the most desirable of all things. Happiness is something final and self-sufficient, the end of all action. Okay? What he's saying there is, if you think about all the things men want, happiness is always at the top, and everything else on that list serves happiness. Aquinas' point, as I just mentioned, is that all those things on the list below it that help us be happy, none of them can be equated with happiness. All right. So our first option is, can something below us like wealth, power, fame, influence, can those things make us perfectly happy? The answer is no, because all those goods are finite and they all run out anyhow, right? Their goodness is imperfect and finite, stuff like that. Okay, so number one's out. The next one we have to look at is, what about goods of soul and body? Now, the way we're going to tackle this is we're going to look at 4 views for non-Christian approaches to being happy: hedonism and utilitarianism, which we're going to talk about in this episode, and then stoicism and evolutionism in next week's episode. But we're going to argue here is that the goods of soul and body that these 4 approaches give us are also deficient. Okay, and we'll take each one at a time. So let's jump in. Non-Christian pursuit of happiness. How about hedonism? Okay, so first let's define what it is. Hedonism says that pleasure is the end of life and the highest good. So what the hedonists want to say is maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain is the point of life. Okay. Now, important to note here, what they don't mean is that you maximize pleasure in the sense of like you list the most unpleasurable things to do and then you go do those things. So if someone said, well, I think, I've heard heroin feels really good and sex is really attractive. So I'm going to do both of those things. And that's a hedonistic view of life. Philosophical hedonists would actually deny that. Okay. When you do things like abuse drugs and alcohol, when you have sex too much and things like that, there's bad, painful consequences that come with it. So hedonists, at least philosophical ones, they're not opposed to things like virtue. They think virtue has a role in hedonism, but they'll say, listen, pleasure is the point of life. What virtue does is it helps us maximize pleasure and minimize the amount of pain. So hedonists would say alcohol is a very pleasurable thing. So they would be for drinking it, but they would be for drinking it in moderation because hangovers are painful. Okay, if that makes sense. Okay, that's the hedonist approach. Now, what's wrong with this thing? Why is a hedonist wrong? First, let's see what they get right. The hedonist is correct that pleasure is a necessary ingredient to happiness. Okay, it'd be weird to say that you can have a happy life that is nothing but racked in pain. Okay, that'd be sort of odd. Okay, so they are right that pleasure has a role in the happy and good life. But let's think about what pleasure is. Pleasure is the accompaniment of the normal exercise of our faculties that exists for other purposes. Okay, what do I mean by that? Pleasure reinforces other things that are good for us, but the point of those things is not pleasure. Take our desire for food, for example. Our desire for food is there because food is for our sustenance. Now, food is pleasurable, okay, because that motivates us to eat. But the whole point of food is nutrition and sustenance. If a person takes the pleasure of food and makes that the point, they ruin themselves, okay? So pleasure can accompany food, but the whole point of food is something else. Same thing's true for drink. I'd use the same example. Same is true for sex. Okay, the point of sex is procreation, not pleasure. Now, sex is pleasurable, which motivates us to do it, but that's not the point of it. When a person chases drink or food or sex for the pleasure alone, it ruins them. Okay, which shows us that pleasure accompanies things working well, but it's not the point. Okay. So what I want you to see is there's a distinction between the pleasure of an activity and the point of an activity. Well, if hedonism's true, pleasure has to be the point of life, but it's not. It's clearly not. Okay. It comes along with other things, but it's not the point itself. Okay. Second, pleasures in life are not attainable by all men at all times. So people who don't have pleasurable lives, maybe they've got cancer or things like that, the hedonist has to say that their life has no meaning. If pleasure is the meaning of life, then if you don't have pleasure, your life is meaningless. That's ridiculous. Okay. When a person's in pain, whether it's something as simple as the flu or cancer, I don't think any of us are going to look at that person's life and say, yeah, they live a meaningless life because they have pain. That's ridiculous. Okay. So if you do identify the meaning of life with pleasure, those are the negative sides that come with it, which for me and for you, hopefully, shows why hedonism is utterly deficient. Okay. So that one's out. Well, what is utilitarianism? The reason why I put these two together is because utilitarianism is a form of hedonism. So for utilitarianism, they believe that pleasure is the point of life, but here's the rub. They do not believe in selfish pleasure. They believe in pleasure of the group. For utilitarian, the point of life is to maximize the greatest number of pleasure for the greatest number of people. So there's a social justice aspect to the utilitarian model. An easy way to illustrate utilitarianism, guys, is this is the way that our government works. Okay. So when our government makes laws, they don't study the nature of ethics and virtue. What do? They take a poll. Okay. So when our government's going to make a law, they take a poll. They'll say, okay, for gay marriage or legalization of marijuana or whatever, they'll take a poll and find out what people want. Then what a political negotiation is, they negotiate to give as many people as possible what they want. And then the people who, the parts they don't get what they want, they try to explain to you why that's no big deal so that everybody's happy and at peace. So if you want to think about what utilitarianism is, it's like the way the government works. Okay. Maximize pleasure for the most amount of people. All right. What's wrong with this view? An altruistic view of pleasure. Okay. This idea that the meaning of life is to help people and maximize their pleasure, make their lives better. This can't be the meaning of life. Though altruism is a good thing, it cannot be the meaning of life. And here's why. I got two criticisms for it. First, what does that, if helping people is the meaning of life, then the people's lives who are being helped are meaningless. Okay, a lot of people miss this. This is where the social justice wars in Catholicism miss this. If helping people is the meaning of life, then those being helped are living meaningless lives. And that's just not true. Okay. So the helping people, as good as that is, cannot be the meaning of life. Second reason why this doesn't work is, what if we get to the point where no one needs help anymore? If we got to that point, then life itself would become meaningless. So here's what's really weird. Somebody says the meaning of life is to help other people. Okay. Let's say, for sake of argument, everyone gets helped. What's then that mean about our lives? Our lives are meaningless. Okay. So in principle, utilitarianism just doesn't work. All right. Now let's rehash this. And then we'll close up for today. Hedonism says pleasure is the meaning of life. Pleasure, there's a grain of truth in that. Okay. A life without pleasure, okay, would not be a happy one. Okay. It wouldn't lose its meaning, but it wouldn't be as happy. So they do have a grain of truth in there. But pleasure cannot work, okay, as a meaning of life, because pleasure is not the goal. Pleasure just kind of accompanies when everything's working well. Okay. Utilitarians say the meaning of life is to help people, but that can't be true. No, the grain of truth in that is we do need to help our neighbor to live good and happy lives. But utilitarianism can't be true, because helping people makes the person being helped have a meaningless life, which is ridiculous. And then the second thing, what it does is, once everybody's been helped, life becomes meaningless, which is ridiculous. Okay. So hedonism and utilitarianism are non-Christian approaches that fail for those reasons. And then the final reason they fail, and I'll wrap it up here, is the fact that these are this worldly worldviews. Living life for pleasure or living life to help other people completely focuses on this world reality. Both these visions of ethics are atheistic in their nature, because they don't believe in God. They don't believe in an afterlife and things like that. And that's just not us. Okay. But I think I'm going to wrap up there. So hedonism and utilitarianism are out. What we're going to look at next week is Stoicism and evolutionism. Hope you guys have a blessed week. I'll see you next time.